Good day, everyone. So we have a very well written comment here from Zing talking about a bit about the team building space. I actually like that sort of phrase when it comes to Nilou and her sort of kit. And essentially, the argument here is that unfortunately, Nilou is in a space where her team building options are kind of restricted due to her niche sort of passive. So let's take a bit of a deep dive into this, and I think it will be quite a fun little discussion. So let's look at the team building space for a character like Nilou. So the first thing we have to sort of acknowledge is that whenever you are in the non-dendro space, in other words, there is no other dendro unit on your team, Nilou's passive won't matter. It doesn't matter if there are restrictions or no restrictions, none of that matters since there are no dendro cores. So in this case, you would want to use Nilou as a supportive unit for her on-demand portable AoE Hydro application that is asynchronous. In other words, it's not ticking at a set interval, it's not restricted to one instance per second that you have to trigger with normal attacks. It literally triggers when you touch an enemy, and then that enemy, the Hydra application to that enemy from Nilou herself has got its own internal cooldown of 2 seconds, which is the lowest out of all of the other Hydra units in the game. Xingqiu has about 2.5 if he hugs enemies, and Barbara has about 3 or something seconds if she hugs enemies. The other way in which you can use Nilou, of course, is in a sort of vaporized teams as a sub DPS, or if you have her at a C6 level, she can be your main DPS. So yes, in the non-dendro space, she can be easily replaced by other Hydra units that in other sorts of teams might provide more value, but Nilou is still functional enough. We cannot deny this. There can still be future characters that can synergize with Nilou in the non-dendro space. One of the things that you'll find is even though Nilou is usable, she might not be as meta-defining, and on that point, the thing about meta and Genshin Impact is precisely that: most effective tactics available. So the amount of teams and characters that are used at the top end when it comes to meta teams is in of itself really restricted. So a meta freeze team would consist of 4 specific characters, but that does not diminish the fact that the playstyle of freeze is meta or not meta. In other words, if you have an abyss that favors freeze teams, you can have a set of characters that will be the best in that role, but you can also slot in Nilou into a functional freeze team that can still clear the spiral abyss for you, and in my opinion, that is good enough. Then finally, my last little point before we move on to the Dendro core space here is that there are a lot of other characters that have passives where if you take them out of certain team comps and sort of compositions, you'll find that their passives are rather pointless. In other words, those passives would be virtually indistinguishable from the same passive just having a sort of team building restriction tacked onto it. I think this is a sort of implicit point that a lot of people seem to fail when they sort of make arguments against Nilou. Certainly the little Goro argument that I can use Goro in some sort of other completely non-geo team and he still has his passive that gives defense percentage is kind of hollow in that sort of sense. So yes, Nilou in the non-dendro space is perfectly usable. There are no team restrictions or team building problems, and she can still synergize potentially with current characters that we have not yet discovered or with future characters. So how about the dendro core reaction space? So this is where things get really fun. Obviously, in burning teams, at the moment, you don't really want Nilou and you don't want to run aggravate teams as well. So this space is once again just unavailable to Nilou, but that is also the same as saying that this space is also unavailable to many other characters that would fit the bill, so that's not really saying that much. Now let's look at Nilou's current mechanics. So the argument here is, given her current mechanics and how they are currently functioning, how would they work if the restriction on her bountiful cores was actually lifted and you could use it in burgeon teams? Well, from a pragmatic perspective, you would run into a lot of problems. So in a burgeon team, you'd have all these bountiful cores exploding in a 0.5 triggering interval, which means that your odds of triggering burgeon would be a lot less. You'd have less opportunity to trigger it because the cores do not persist on like the battlefield. In which case you might just sort of recognize that why don't we just ditch the pyro units and just return back to double dendro, double hydro in Nilou's sort of bloom team? So in and of itself, I don't think it's that much of a restriction in the Burgeon teams. And in the hyper bloom teams, you have a character, let's say like Kuki that has a 1.5 sort of second triggering interval, or like Raiden Shogunate that has 0.9. You still have to somehow get that to align with the very quick 0.5 triggering interval from the Dendro cores. And even if you could trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon on Nilou's bountiful cores as they're forming, the question would then be, well, how do you calculate the damage? Does Nilou's increase in damage apply before or after the 3 times multiplier? It's just really, really wacky and wonky. And I think a lot of people might actually come to the conclusion that what if we just take Nilou out, we generate more Hyperbloom cores, we trigger all of them, and hey, we will have a better situation. Or, you know, we ditch the Electro character and we just trigger more of Nilou's own bountiful cores. That might just even be better. I think from a practical perspective, you might find that trying to force Nilou's bountiful cores into either of these two teams might end up having the opposite effect, where one character is being utilized less because Nilou is stealing all of the sort of stage time because her cores explode so bountifully. And the other thing is that because you're now introducing a Pyro and Electro unit, you by default have less Dendro and Hydro going, and that would be available to your team, and that could then have its own sort of complications. From a real pragmatic perspective, I don't think Nilou fits into this space, or this space, or this space, or this space as her current mechanics work. Now, of course, we can change her current mechanics, but to change that would also then, unfortunately, in a weird kind of way, change Nilou's Super Bloom, but then we can't really have an argument anymore because we've now changed the thing that we're complaining about to suit another. It's just becomes a big mess. Right, so let's finally address the elephant in the room. What about the space of all other bloom teams with at least one other non-hydro dendro sort of element? So if you look in game, something like this, which would be a sort of fridge team or some sort of variant like that. I think a fridge team is something like Ganyu, and then you have some sort of animo unit. I think a lot of people use Venti and so on, but whatever. The point is, what would happen in teams like this? Well, you'd have a very big problem because Nilou's bountiful cores explode so quickly. You would exhaust your Hydro application very quickly, and your Dendro application can actually sort of take over, which means you won't have enough space for your Nilou to sort of freeze or to apply sort of enough Hydro. In that case, you would probably have to bring in another Hydro unit, which would diminish in essence the value of your sort of cryo unit. It would also then take away from the fact that you could have potentially used an animo unit for grouping and so on. So the entire core fundamental mechanics of how bountiful cores work might actually invalidate teams like these. We know fridge teams are not the strongest teams, and the reason why they work is because once you've applied your Dendro and your Hydro and you've generated all your bountiful cores, you don't need to focus on applying Dendro anymore. You can now focus only on applying Hydro and freezing the enemies and then waiting for those cores to explode. But in a certain sense, this also doesn't feel very optimal. It doesn't feel very optimal for Nilou in terms of maximizing her potential. It doesn't feel optimal for maximizing the potential of your cryo character. Your cryo characters might preferably, once you have a Shenna on the team, they might want to have a Sucrose and guess what, even a Kokomi with a TDS or whatever. At the end of the day, even if Nilou didn't have the restrictions, forming other sort of teams might not be as valid or as valuable, in which case you might just default back to just using Nilou in her own Super Bloom team. Nilou's problem from a sort of team drafting perspective is not that there is a restriction on a passive, but that the entire mechanics of how bountiful cores work necessarily lead you to concluding that Nilou is better off in a 2 Dendro 2 Hydro sort of team. I don't think it's the restriction itself more so than the mechanics. I think this is really important to highlight. If you change the mechanics to make Nilou more accessible, and hence you have more team building for the sake of more team building, then Nilou herself would lose her identity as a sort of character, because whilst you can use her without the Golden Chalice effect in all of the other teams and so on, when it comes to what is the unique thing that she's going to contribute, you would find that, yeah, if she doesn't contribute a lot in terms of just increasing core damage, then what would be the point of the character? So I do find that the mechanic itself that she has makes it unique. It gives her a good niche. It separates her from other Hydro characters, and it solves a lot of other balance problems. Once again, if you sort of took this away, or if you had to use this mechanic, it wouldn't make sense. If you sort of took away the mechanic and Nilou increased just Dendrocore damage, then you could probably do better by including just a, let's say, Yelon or Xingshu just to sort of aid in doing more damage beyond what Nilou would contribute in terms of the Dendrocores exploding at a much slower pace of about 5-6 seconds instead of every 0.5 seconds. So honestly, from my perspective, Nilou is fine as is, and I don't think that the team building is as problematic. Cheers.